Welcome to the History Channel here in University Terrace, and we thank you for joining us today on a special segment today we have about George Washington.
And now a little jingle to get us started.
We're gonna learn about George Washington today. We're gonna learn about George Washington today. We talked about the cherry tree and how we learned about it in history and how it's now a famous mythology.
Howdy. Thanks for joining us. Now, we talked a little about the mythologies in that little jingle there. Not much, but we'll get into it in a little bit. George Washington was born in 1732, and he was kind of born in Virginia, where he spent most of his life. He grew up on Pope's Creek Plantation, or at least he was born there, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. The Pope's Creek Plantation was right next to a creek called Pope's Creek, and I don't think it had anything to do with the actual Pope over in whatever, Catholic faith and whatnot. But shortly after he was born, 3 years later, his family moved to Little Huntington Creek Plantation, where we now know that today as Mount Vernon, and that's kind of a historical landmark, his home, where he lived after the war, which we'll talk about later. George was the oldest of 6 children. His parents had his dad remarried once, but once his dad remarried, after his first wife passed away, he had 6 kids, and George was the oldest, so he was the first. They moved again in 1738 to Ferry Farm, which is where many of the mythologies that we have heard about kind of so-called happened, even though the mythologies didn't actually happen, which is, one was he chopped down the cherry tree on his plantation, and the other one was he tossed the silver dollar over the Rappahannock River from the plantation that he lived on. When his dad, Augustine Washington, died in 1743, George Washington inherited the farm, or the family plantation, from his dad. Now, he was only 16 at the time, so he had to wait till he was 21 to actually inherit it. So his mom was actually kind of she took care of it for that kind of short period until he was 21. But at the Ferry Farm where he lived at, Washington learned the principles of agriculture, a passion that he would endure throughout his life. His education growing up, he was, it began around the age of 7. He was tutored, had private tutors that tutored him at his home, and he also went to some private schools around the area. But he never actually got to go study abroad or learn another language because his father passed away early on, and he wasn't able to go do that. He had to stay at home and help take care of the plantation. So he never learned French. So when he was 17 years old, Washington became a surveyor. This is kind of, moving past his childhood into the pre-president years we're getting into. He became a surveyor, and he was very successful and had a profitable career doing that. He worked hard, and that's kind of who he was. He saved his money, and he's very, very successful. And one day he joined the British Army to gain a commission, to make a commission, because he was all about making money and working hard. And so he joined the Army, and the first kind of thing he was known for was when they were in the Ohio country, and we learned about this in class. He shot the first bullet, kind of the French and Indian War, and this is when George Washington was young and naive a little bit, and as he went on, he became a better war general, but as of right now, that wasn't the best thing he could have done, because after that, when he shot the French war general, they weren't able to, he shot a French, and he was talking to the French war general afterwards, and he couldn't understand him necessarily because he didn't learn French when he was little. So there's a whole debacle there, and the French war general actually got killed by the Indians there and it kind of set off the French and Indian War. And so now we'll move on. What he was mainly known for was taking the Hessians by surprise on Christmas Eve, which was the Continental Army was really lacking. They didn't have a lot of spirits. They were lacking supplies, and he had the idea to attack the Hessians in Trenton on Christmas Eve day when the Hessians were going to be ready for it. And they weren't ready for it because the Continental Army did not take any casualties at all. They took Trenton, they took all of the Hessian supplies, and it fueled the rest of the war for the Continental Army. It was a turning point. It helped them essentially win the Revolutionary War. And George Washington was the one who decided that. We watched the movie in class, and that's why he was really important to it. So he kind of, after the war then, he went back, lived in Mount Vernon for a little bit, and then, as we know now, the U.S. wanted him to become President of the United States. So I'll turn over to my man here, Mr. Ryan Bruns.
So the two topics that I'll talk about is the president and then his life after. So during his presidency, there were some key things that he has done that now every president tends to do, and one of them is he started the cabinet to advise him, which every president now has a cabinet. Also, he only served 2 4-year terms of the presidency, even though a vast majority of people wanted him to keep serving the U.S. as president. So 2 terms is now the limit for any president, which was set by him. He established several peace treaties with the Indians when he was there in office. He also took multiple measures to lower the debt ceiling, which is something that we don't happen to see a lot today. And also, he was at the Constitutional Convention, he was unanimously chosen president, which is the only president to be unanimously chosen. And also, he is the only president while in office to personally lead troops against a rebellion, and this was the Whiskey Rebellion that he led against. So after the presidency, he refused to serve a 3rd term as he wanted to move back to Mount Vernon and back onto the farm, and also his physical capabilities, he could tell, were starting to decline while he was in office, so he refused to serve that 3rd term. So in March of 1797, he turned over control of the office and the country to John Adams. He moved back to Mount Vernon and worked on his plantation, which had declined in production while he was away because he was obviously very efficient at running his plantation, so when he went away, it declined in production.
Okay, sorry for that brief intermission, folks. We're going to finish up here.
On December 13th in 1799, he was riding around horseback, checking out his land in a driving snowstorm, and the next day he woke up very sick and ill. He eventually died on December 14th, 1799. He was so well liked in many towns and cities that they held mock funerals for him, and also the British fleet paid him tribute. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Thank you for joining us today, folks. So from me, Ryan Bruns.
And me, Zach Goodchild.
Have a good night, and thank you.
Go Bears.